Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I thought I would chat with you guys a little bit about why both fasted lifting or training and fasted cardio really don't work that well. They're really not ideal, and that's based upon the opinions of far more educated people than I. So let me put on my +5 hat of weaponsmithing, work on skilling up my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this. All right, what people need to understand, I know with intermittent fasting being a popular trend, this is stuff that we need to be talking about. It's become a popular trend again, and as I've said before, I don't think it works as magically as people try to proclaim it does, but I think it's still a valuable tool. It's something I'm even utilizing partially. I'm not doing full-on intermittent fasting while I'm successfully losing weight right now. So I think it has value as a tool. I think it has absolutely good value as a weight loss tool and weight management tool. But understanding how that tool works is probably a good idea if you're going to use it. And here's the problem we come to. And this is stuff that's been studied. It's been studied heavily because researchers do care. And I remember a few years ago, Dr. Brad Schoenfeld did a bunch of data on it. Now, I got into a debate with him on social media over it because I pointed out to him that if he's going to talk about bodybuilders, and that's what's funny, he's all concerned with bodybuilding, but his studies aren't done on people on drugs. Well, if they're not done on people on drugs, you're not studying bodybuilding. Because most natural probably 50% of natural bodybuilders even use drugs. So if you're actually doing the studies on really natural people, you're not really studying bodybuilding. Now, you're helping the layperson, and that I agree with, but let's not call it what it is. Because we know most successful bodybuilders, even in the natural ranks, are on something. You almost have to be today, and that's reality. They're exceptions because they're genetic freaks. That's your exceptions. So the point we get to with that is that I did point out to him, I think you would get different results if you tested a bunch of people who were pin and trend before they do their cardio. I think you would have got very, very different results. But when he did the studies on it, what they found when he studied it in the lab is that people who did fasted cardio lost less fat. People say, what? That it shouldn't work. You're fasted. You should be tapping right into your body fat. Well, hypothetically, yes. But that's not how the body works. So people need to understand weight loss and fat loss is really about total energy turnover, right? The fact that you're fasted and yes, you're tapping further into your body fat during that segment of the day doesn't mean that you're going to lose more body fat because it's still about total energy turnover. And here's the other thing. We're all eating food, right? None of us are eating a 0-calorie diet. You do know you're burning the food you eat throughout the day also. And the size of the calorie deficit you create seems to be more important than timing for fat loss. And no one's saying timing and stuff doesn't matter, but it is total energy turnover is your biggest variable for weight loss. For weight loss, not just fat loss, because fat loss is somewhat separate from weight loss. But what they found is that there's the reason for it, people just burned less calories. In other words, someone who's fasted instead of someone who fed before they did the cardio, guess what? Doing the same amount of cardio at the same perceived exertion, didn't pedal as hard on the bike. They didn't run as fast. They burned less calories per minute. And what ended up happening as a result of that, less calories burned doing the physical activity equal, guess what? Less weight loss. Because you use less energy. Because you're tired or you're weak or you're more lethargic when you're fasted. You can say, I don't feel that way. Well, how you feel doesn't matter when you start measuring it. When we measure stuff on machines, what you perceive might be 10% off from what's really happening in the real world. Like you might say, well, I feel just as strong or feel like I output just as much energy when I'm fasted. In fact, my brain feels clear. Well, what they're testing is that, no, actually, you probably burn about 10% less calories doing your cardio because you're going to pedal slightly slower, even though you perceive that you're putting out the same effort because it is the same amount of effort. You don't have as much training fuel. Therefore, you do less work. And that's kind of the interesting thing. That's one of the reasons a lot of people think their metabolism is going down when we're losing weight. Why? Because we seem to sometimes reduce calories and weight loss doesn't always speed up. Do you know why? Because humans are amazing at retaining body fat. There's a reason we get fat easy, right? We have an obesity epidemic. It should be pretty obvious why that is. Why? Because humans like to gorge and we like to reserve energy. When your food gets restricted, you become lazier. right? In other words, it's the natural tendency, and that's not a bad thing. That's not calling anyone lazy as a person. It's not a character flaw. It means that your ancestors developed tools in your genes to survive starving to death. That's what it means. It means that your ancestors were the people who successfully avoided starving to death through different periods of time in history, right? Because when food is restricted, we tend to move a little less. We don't put quite as much energy into things. It requires an extra effort on our part. It requires more effort on our part to do the same amount of work. We just tend to be lazy. We fidget less. We move less. When we exercise, we won't train quite as hard. When we get on that bike, we won't pedal quite as hard. We'll try to preserve energy, and it's not a conscious thing. It's your body and your brain not wanting you to starve to death. Your body doesn't want you to lose weight, because losing weight is associated with dying, with starving to death. So you have natural mechanisms in place for that, and guess what? When you're fasted, they kick in. You don't pedal as hard on the bike. You might perceive that you are, but you're not. And they found that consistently in the research. So you lose less body fat because your body tries to preserve energy. People who eat more can train harder, right? That's kind of the point I made in an earlier video I did today discussing that of really, if you're really trying to get the best conditioning from an athletic perspective, eating enough that you don't lose weight is going to give you better endurance, better conditioning. It's going to improve your run times better. Why? Because you're fueling the training and you're fueling the recovery and the adaptations. You're not using it as a weight loss tool. You're using it to become a better runner. You're using it to become a better cyclist, right? And just like with lifting weights, that requires food. That's being athletic. Well, it kind of works the same way here. When your food is lower, even when your goal is weight loss, you're going to use less energy. Your energy turnover tends to be lower. Now, we get into the same thing when we come to weight training. A lot of people say, well, I do just fine training fasted. Well, you can think you do fine all you want, but the reality is all the data out there shows that you are producing less force. You're recruiting less muscle fibers. You will not train as hard when you are fasted. And if you are trying to stimulate muscle growth, you will stimulate less muscle growth fasted. Furthermore, you're going to have more muscle protein breakdown. We run into the same thing with the fasted cardio. Guess what? You lose more muscle during fasted cardio. Why? Because you're tapping more into the reserves in your body. Do you think your body burns purely body fat when you go into a calorie deficit? You don't think it looks for other, so you don't think it looks for muscle tissue also? You don't think when your blood glucose levels are low and your cortisol levels start rising, that the cortisol doesn't break down muscle tissue protein for glucose also? It does. It does. That's one of the things that cortisol does. That's one of the things that cortisol does. And the lower your blood sugar goes and the lower your insulin levels go, the higher your cortisol goes. Cortisol, it's one reason it causes muscle growth as a response to training. Elevated cortisol does cause more muscle tissue breakdown, which if you have an anabolic response from your training going on, that's great, because that will also push it in the other direction to reach homeostasis. But if it's from doing cardio and your cortisol has risen because you're fasted more, guess what? That will equal a little more muscle protein tissue breakdown also. So fasted cardio, actually, the situation you have is that if you don't have anabolic drugs in place to help you, you're completely natural, you will probably lose slightly more muscle and you will lose slightly less body fat and less body weight doing it, unless the fasting creates a smaller caloric intake, which is the reason people do it, and it does work for that, right? That's what's going on. So ultimately, the problem you have is that fasted training, in theory, it looks great, but in practice, and when it's looked at in the lab and looked at in studies, it doesn't pan out as well as you would think. And then people say, yeah, but this pro bodybuilder and that guy does it. Yeah, but they're also on 5 grams of gear and growth hormone and IGF-1, and they're pinning all sorts of fat burners that have nutrient partitioning effects before their fasted cardio, right? Some of these guys are pinning before every cardio session $50 worth of growth hormone right before their fasted cardio, while having testosterone levels that are 20 times the normal range. You don't think that affects the results they're getting a little bit? You don't think it affects it just a little bit? You don't think they burn a little more fat and preserve muscle better as a result of some of what they're doing? All right, that's not the way that you should go about deciding what you're going to do, guys. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.